My name is Jack Rotherham, the publisher at The Hill, and welcome to this morning's event, Preparing for Treatment, Alzheimer's Diagnosis and Care. I would like to start by thanking our sponsors, Biogen and Eisai. We greatly appreciate your support. Today's conversation is particularly timely since November is recognized as Alzheimer's Awareness Month. I am sure all of you are too familiar with the statistics surrounding this challenge in front of us, with nearly 6 million Americans currently facing Alzheimer's. Without new therapies, that number could increase to more than 13 million by the year 2050. Certainly daunting. As efforts continue to bring new treatments to market, researchers are concerned by the lack of doctors, both experienced and qualified, who can diagnose Alzheimer's in its early stages, when medicines may have the greatest impact. 1 year ago, during the first event in this series, we explored whether the American health ecosystem has the necessary infrastructure to manage and deliver a major Alzheimer's breakthrough. Today, we are asking how diagnosis and care can be improved while simultaneously tackling the stigma surrounding this disease. We will hear from lawmakers, health officials, physicians, and patient advocates about the need for a united front. But first, and on a lighter note, a few quick housekeeping issues. In addition to our audience here at the museum, we are also live streaming the event on thehill.com. Please keep your phones on silent throughout the program, but we do encourage you to engage in our discussion on social media. You can follow us on Twitter at The Hill Events and comment using the hashtag ALZtreatment. We are going to be taking questions from the audience during the program, so please be on the lookout for members of our team with the handheld mics. And finally, there is a short feedback survey on your chairs. We would greatly appreciate it if you could fill that out, because we are always curious about how we can make these events even more dynamic. So let's dive right in. We begin this morning with Senator Thom Tillis, a member of the Senate Special Committee on Aging. Senator Tillis has seen the devastating impact of Alzheimer's up too close. Along with his mother and aunts, he was a caregiver for his grandmother who suffered from the disease. In Congress, Senator Tillis has championed legislation advancing the fight and the progress needed today. Welcome, Senator, and joining him on stage is my colleague, The Hill's editor-in-chief, Bob Cusack. Gentlemen, thank you.
Thanks, Jack. And thanks, Senator, for joining us this morning.
My pleasure.
As Jack mentioned, you were a caregiver. I wanted to start off with that. What did you learn from that experience?
Well, it actually started when my grandmother started showing signs of her memory and some of her behavior having challenges. I took a long time to get my 4-year degree. I was living up here, and I had a few more courses left, and I went to University of Maryland, University College, to specifically look at death and dying and the grieving process and caregiving for Alzheimer's patients. Mm-hmm. And after the first session on caregiving for Alzheimer's, I called my mom and said, we've got to talk. We're doing this all wrong. And then spent a lot of time trying to educate her, give her the kinds of information that I was receiving, and it put them in a better place because I was observing how difficult it was for them as caregivers. They lived in Florida, I lived in DC. I would travel down there, but it really just galvanized my mind that this is a multi-layered approach that involves doctors and healthcare providers that are qualified, patients that are fully informed, but caregivers who also have the support mechanisms and the information they need to do the best job for the real victim, and that's the patient.
What are some of the biggest myths about Alzheimer's disease?
I think, one of the things is it's not unlike other mental health challenges where people have simplistic views of how to get people back to a former version of reality. They try to, if you're I remember my grandmother forgetting me. I mean, I got to a point where I just went wherever my grandmother wanted to go. So the biggest myth is that you can suddenly have a rational discussion with somebody who's suffering from this horrible disease and then get them back to a place that they may never go back to again. Rather than just trying to find a way to make that moment that you have with them as pleasant as possible for them. And remarkably, if you do that, they do have moments of lucidity where you see that mother or father or grandmother or grandfather again. So I think the biggest myth is I think I can get my parents back to where they were, my brother or sister or my aunt or uncle back to where they were. But with the progression of this disease, that's almost invariably untrue.
What about the stigma of Alzheimer's disease? You know, over the years, I think many people in the audience and watching on the live stream, now they know somebody or that had Alzheimer's or has Alzheimer's disease or knows a relative. How is the stigma, is it still there?
Yeah, again, I go back to, you know, this is just another mental health challenge that we have to address. And I feel like we have to tell people, stigmatizing, if you remember though, we've gone through this before. There used to be a time, I remember back in the late 60s and early 70s, when a family member got cancer, you whispered it. You would never say they had cancer because there was a stigmatism there with this obvious thing that you can x-ray, treat, remove. Now we have that stigmatism now. I mean, we've stigmatized that, but so why don't we look at it the same way? Would you look at a mental health condition or Alzheimer's any differently than you would any form of cancer or any other disease where you can see the manifestation? That's the problem with this disease, but it's still no different. It's just the way that you observe it, or the way that I think we do. We shouldn't be ashamed of it because that's another step to making sure that the patient themselves and the caregivers are in the best position to deal with the disease.
What can D.C. policymakers, Congress, the administration do in the short term and the long term to find a cure?
Well, I think we have to continue to work. I was just down at Biogen a couple of weeks ago reviewing some of the great work that they're doing. There's a number of people a number of organizations that are making great progress on at least treatments, hopefully someday a cure or even a vaccine. What we have to do is make sure we get as lean as possible. There's good work going on with the FDA. There's more work that needs to be done. Get as lean as possible so that we can accelerate research and not only be lean for the purposes of time, the length of time to actually get some drug or treatment with efficacy that should be applied to the population, but also to reduce the cost when those drugs ultimately become available. So we have to figure out how government playing the absolutely important role of regulatory oversight to make sure safety and efficacy are at the standards that we expect in the United States, but always be looking at ways to do it as light-handed and as lean as possible. The other thing we have to do is distinguish, I think that we have law, right now it is very, very popular to cast everybody in biotech and pharma in the same lot as, let's say, Turing Pharmaceuticals. That is very dangerous. When lawmakers treat all biotech and pharmaceutical companies the way that they do bad actors, you will have a chilling effect on risk-taking and innovation. And you have to, so obviously when I say I'm up for election in 2020, there will probably be an ad saying Thom Tillis is in the pockets of pharma because of he said something kind of, it has nothing to do with this industry. It has to do with the outcomes that come from this industry. And so we have to be very careful and very focused in the way we target bad actors in the industry. But if you cast them all in the same light, I used to work in research and development. How does this work? If the risk of bringing something to market gets higher, I have fewer things that I'm willing to invest in on the front end so that I can ultimately pay for those investments. You reduce the buy box for research and development, for going after new NDAs or INDs or moving into clinical trials. You will reduce the pace of innovation, and for an element like Alzheimer's, that's a very dangerous proposition.
Do you see a lot of your colleagues in Congress lumping the industry together? And speaking of 2020, a lot of Democrats are going to be running, maybe 20, maybe 30?
Yeah, actually, I think right now this is becoming a bipartisan thing. I think that that the pharmaceutical industry becomes a very easy target because there's a reason for some of it. There have been bad actors. There have been, we've heard, Turing's probably the most egregious example, but there are some illogical pricing outcomes out there that we have to work through. But to suggest that because one segment of it is illogical and not well-founded in terms of the cost of the drug or the treatment, it's irrational to think that they all are. I think that we need to figure out a very systematic way to go through this process, figure out what transparency we should have in terms of the underlying cost of a drug with respect to other jurisdictions, but not necessarily go in assuming that everybody's overpricing and that everybody should cut their medication or everybody should cut their costs. Because if you do that, you cut the revenue streams that are actually allowing a lot of these incredibly promising treatments to come to market. And if you do it, I mean, you need to own, if lawmakers, not you all, if lawmakers decide to do that, then they have to own what I think will be over time a lengthening of the typical cycles for innovative drugs and treatments. I believe that that will happen if we're not careful with the way that we rightfully put pressure on the industry, rightfully identify bad actors, rightfully drive down costs, but not do it at the expense of innovation and some of the results that, I mean, we're on the brink of incredible innovations in autism and Alzheimer's and a lot of other of these diseases, and I don't want to slow that down.
Can you talk about the economics of treatments for Alzheimer's and their estimates that the amount of people who have Alzheimer's could double over the next couple of decades, but the need for investment with the baby boom generation retiring and of how that's going to be a crush on the system, but in the long term, this can be actually a cost saver.
Right. I think we need to start working now on that, the cost benefit. If you take a look at end-of-life care for Alzheimer's sufferers, it's a huge cost, and it's a huge cost that a lot of it is borne through safety net programs by the federal government. Right. So when we start looking at, if we go down this path and we find a drug that provides treatment that produces a very different outcome for the patient, then we have to figure out the extent to which we invest in that to defray the cost of these drugs at whatever that reasonable price is, because we know that for the broader population, the longevity of that patient base is going to be such that it'll more than pay for itself. So you get the win-win. You're reducing over time the ultimate cost to the taxpayers, and you're producing a better quality of life over the course of that same period of time.
Can you talk about bipartisanship, on health care, the Affordable Care Act? It doesn't really exist, okay? But on this issue, it does. There's legislation that Senator Collins has introduced. You're a co-sponsor as well as Senator Markey, who we'll hear from. Is there a lot of bipartisanship on Alzheimer's?
I think one of the reasons why I like the aging committee is, but for one or two people, you really have to work hard to be partisan on the aging committee. It's like being partisan on the Veterans Affairs Committee.
Who are those one or two people?
I won't say. Let's just say it's bipartisan. But I think that when you talk about these sorts of policies, it's not unlike I chair the personnel subcommittee. We've made a lot of progress on autism for military families in terms of some of our personnel policies, and I think that's really where people kind of check it at the door, because you see the consequence of gridlock on these sorts of issues. So it's some of the things that I find most rewarding.
What is the role of stakeholders, both for consumer groups, physician groups, a lot of healthcare stakeholders who obviously need to be working in the same direction, but sometimes they work against one another?
Well, that's, you get into all kinds of challenges with, over time, scope of practice. Right now, what may be reserved for a higher end of certifications and education for the docs and specialists may ultimately, for the base that we're supplying, may have to be provided by physician assistants or various certifications in the nursing profession. So you're going to continue to work on scope of practice. I think you're going to continue to see competition at some level in the marketplace for these various treatments and possible cures or vaccinations that will come in the years and decades ahead. Some of that competition's good. I can see it more on the research and development and biotech pharmaceutical side. A lot of the competition within the healthcare industry, I really, at its base, I tend to have a positive view of human nature. I think at its base, it's because they genuinely believe they're the best suited to provide the care. But over time, we have to deal with the reality of the number of people who are affected and the number of caregivers that we may have that don't match up with it. And that's when you get into the scope of practice issues that I dealt with when I was in the State House. It was one of the worst things. It was like watching your family fight. I mean, they're all good people, the nurses, nurse anesthetists, anesthesiologists, ophthalmologists, optometrists, all of them. So in that same chain, except the healthcare providers for Alzheimer's patients, we got to be very conscious of how we get them to play nice and make sure that we keep the level of supervision at one that's in the best interest of the patient, but not at the expense of broad access to care.
In a couple of minutes, we'll open it up for questions from the audience. I wanted to ask you, how important is early diagnosis?
It's very important. And then you get into a discussion that I just had a week or so ago now with these tests that can reasonably predict whether or not you're going to get it. We've got to, at some point, I'm sure everybody will rush to get that test when we have a cure or some treatment with efficacy. Nobody wants it now, or very few people want it. They don't want to know that they have something that there may not be any cure or treatment for. But that early detection is what's going to best prepare you to get a healthcare network that's going to provide you support, to have providers that are best prepared to take you through a journey that may start in your home, may go to assisted living, may go to a different. You got to anticipate the reality of this. The problem, the sad part about this disease is it's so predictable once you get it. And the sooner you're prepared for that, the better off you are.
We'll open up for audience Q&A. We have people with microphones. If you can just raise your hand and wait for the microphone to get to you, and then just identify yourself. Oh, there's one microphone.
Edward Abraham's Personalized Medicine Coalition. I wonder if you would say a few words about President Trump's proposal to link pharmaceutical pricing in Part B to an international price index.
I was more or less, you may have kind of caught my drift on the sort of bipartisan nature of demonizing the industry and casting them all as spending too much money. I think that the president is right to ask the legitimate question, why does this drug that looks the same way, does the same thing in this country, cost that much and this much in another country? But it's not as simple as saying because we can. We need to do a better job of crosswalking the underlying contributors to the cost of a drug in one country or another, and figure out how you build that up, and then start talking about the margin where there may not be any rational basis for it. So I think that we need to make sure, because I worry about the consequence of, as I said in my earlier comments, I worry about the consequence of it. You just reduce margins to a point to where the recovery period for all the money you put into a drug to begin with gets stretched out, and therefore all these things you'd like to work on in research have to wait. And so we have to strike that balance. You have to understand the project-oriented nature of this, of biotech and pharmaceuticals. And medical devices. You have to understand the research and development portfolio that they have, the failure rate with some, to really understand why there has to be a certain amount of margin to cover the broader portfolio of drugs and medications that they're pursuing. There's going to be some overchargers, and I've told everybody, bring them into aging, take them somewhere else, we'll flog them, shame on them. But I think we've got to be careful that we don't let public opinion get lawmakers to the point to where if you say things like I'm saying, that you become unpopular. Because I'm doing it because of my concern ultimately with the patient. I don't care about any one pharma company or biotech company. I love their industries. I want them to do things well. I care about the results that they produce for patients, and particularly in this case, Alzheimer's victims.
Hi, I'm Sally McAllister with Exelon. I'm an energy company, but I'm here personally because my mom had Lewy body dementia. And one of the most disturbing things that we encountered was the different kinds of care in some of the memory care homes. We were in 2 different locations, paid the same amount. The care was night and day difference. Are you guys looking at anything to address situations like that?
Yeah, a part of that, I think we have to give better guidance to the states. A lot of that ultimately is within the purview of the states. We did a fair amount of work of that in North Carolina. I saw the same thing. When I was traveling and going down to Jacksonville, my grandmother lived in Jacksonville. I saw a sea change difference between the first facility she was in and the second. It was clear that one was not going to work. And it was also clear that they were not really prepared to deal with a large population of Alzheimer's or dementia victims. I remember vividly my grandmother being agitated one time that I came up, and it was, I'm sure, a well-intentioned nurse who was doing the top 10 things you shouldn't do when you're dealing with somebody who's in the second stage of Alzheimer's. Pulled my mother away, my grandmother, she behaved differently. She was a different person within about 15 minutes. So I think it's training, it's the environment, the facility, but a lot of that relates to training standards if you're going to be a facility that goes beyond just an aging population to a dementia and Alzheimer's population. You have to have certain educational standards there for the providers.
Last question. We had the last election of the 2018 cycle last night. So the margin in the Senate next year will be 53-47. As you know, the House has flipped. Yes. And now we have divided government. So it's going to be a very different Congress. Do you see, you mentioned you're up in 2020. It's going to be a lot of 2020 politics in the next several months going forward. Do you see that there could actually stuff could get done in the new Congress?
I think it can. You know, I served as Speaker for 2 different terms in the state of North Carolina, and quite honestly, my most productive 2 years was when I had a Democrat governor and I didn't have supermajorities. So I think there's a path. The leaders are going to have to decide what they want to do. Mm-hmm. Hopefully, that means that we can work on some big things. Obviously, one of the tests for everybody says now it's time to be bipartisan. So if you'll just accept my extreme position and vote with it, we'll be bipartisan. But what you have to do is think through math, all right? If you have a Republican president, you have a Republican Senate, you have a Democratic House, then I think you should rightfully expect that a bipartisan outcome is somewhere right of center. If we had the reverse, then you should rightfully expect that the outcome should be somewhere left of center. So if you have Leader McConnell say, I want this thing that's clearly on the scale 3/4 of the way towards a conservative end, it should be off the table. I mean, just statistically speaking, reasonably speaking. By the same token, Speaker Pelosi, assuming that she gets elected Speaker, I think that's a safe assumption, should not be coming in and creating an agenda. We'll know within the first 30 days, based on the legislative agenda coming out of the House, if they're genuinely interested in a bipartisan outcome. I'd say probably 60% odds that it will be a 2020 legislative agenda, not a bipartisan legislative agenda. I hope I'm wrong. But that's not all bad, because that still provides us with, those of us who still want to get things done in spite of that environment. You go for the singles and doubles. You go for the things like letters to the FDA to say, keep pounding on getting the regulatory framework right to stimulate innovation. You go to these various agencies, you accelerate some of your oversight, and then you work on a lot of the consensus legislation that happens every day here. So things will get done. The question is whether or not any bigger. I'd love to get immigration reform done. I'd love to get criminal justice reform done. I think that in reality, if you look at all the options, somewhere barely left of center or right of center is what the nation would like to see done. I'd love to see our leaders step up and actually do that. I don't think there'll be any political consequences, a great human consequence, but we'll know probably by Groundhog Day. We'll see whether or not the groundhog goes in for another 20 months.
We run out of time. Please thank Senator Tillis, and I hand it back to Jack. Thanks, Senator.
Appreciate it.